Yanovich is leaving Warhammer 40k. Whether for good or not, only time will tell, but this does deserve some discussing, as it's in many ways the culmination of what I've been saying now for 10 years, in essence. For no other reason, because I do like to point out how Arch has been right all along, and this is probably one of my longest running "fuck you, I was right," as when I initially started talking about how Warhammer 40k was going to inevitably become a victim of our currently ongoing cultural disputes, and also the mainstreamification of entertainment in general a decade ago, that made me deeply unpopular, both amongst the corporations, of course, as I lost a great deal of numbers of sponsorship back then, and access to the companies. However, more interestingly was, of course, how unpopular it made me with the creator community, amongst other people, well, like text-to-speech devices producers and most of the other ones, as nobody wanted to hear that the gravy train was inevitably going to run off its tracks. Indeed, their very participation in the gravy train would only hasten its demise, and yet here we are. So, Yanovich, of course, talks about the recent spat of copyright lawsuits, and how GW has now, by a long time ago, established a pattern of behavior where they will go after you at some point. It may not be tomorrow, it may not be next week, next month, or next year, but sooner or later, as they transition from a company making wargame and miniatures to a company that lives off its IP in the same way that Disney, in essence, does, sooner or later they will try to eradicate the overwhelming majority of fan content so as to create their own walled-off garden where they can control everything. And a necessary part of this is the replacement of the audience, which I first talked about 3-4 years ago at this point, I think, where Games Workshop doesn't want you. They don't want me, they want everybody else. They want to be Disney, they want to be Star Trek, they want to be mainstream, and they've wanted to be mainstream for a very long time. And many of their core decisions as of late, with Primaris Marines being the leading one, has all been in order to achieve that objective. To be a company that first and foremost rents out their IP to game makers or major studios like Amazon to create entertainment. They don't want to be a miniature manufacturer, they want to be an entertainment property. And, well, you and I are all just baggage in the way of that. We whine about law changes, we complain about how much better it was in the good old days, we point out how Warhammer 40k has lost its soul, and all of this is, of course, nothing that Games Workshop wants to hear right now. Now, this then, of course, leads us on to the question of, is it over? Is the war finished? Is the battle done? Is 40k dead and gone? And to some extent, yes, to some extent, no. I think the blackest of pill that needs swallowing right now is the realization that this was never a battle for us to win at all. Games Workshop itself wanted to go mainstream. It had greed on its side, a rather powerful human emotion, and many others wanted Games Workshop to go mainstream as well. Most of those were the content creators who had the, well, somewhat similar sin of self-aggrandizement. The individuals who got into 40k because it was a trend taking off on YouTube. Indeed, before me, I think there was like a grand total of 1 or 2 other 40k lore channels in total on YouTube, and no Warhammer Fantasy channels, I think, because it wasn't popular. As it became popular, however, the number of people who wanted to benefit from it exploded. This was what Games Workshop wanted, a wider appeal to a broader market who doesn't really care about Warhammer or 40k, but rather, well, benefiting themselves. Which is why when the company approached these individuals with NDAs and said, listen, you signed this and you don't say anything bad about us, and we won't come for you later on in some kind of legal pursuit. They all took it, which is our current state of being right now. And in a situation where these so-called representatives of the fans are already either bought or paid for by the corporation, or so terrified by the corporation that they have chosen to not speak out for 10 years, other than the occasional minor complaint about a model here or there, and the company itself wants to go mainstream, well, there's no stopping that. Simple as. However, this then will transition into what has happened to Star Trek, to Star Wars, to every other popular entity, as they replace the old audience. In fact, we've got a brilliant example with Creative Assembly, which I bring up in context of this all the time. They built up their brand on the back of loyal fans. Well, like, we love Total War. Rome was great, Medieval 2 was great, and then the company thinks, okay, well, we've already got these people's sales. They're going to buy our product regardless, so why should we ever cater to them? Instead, we are going to cater to the other market, obviously. Then they start making garbage. After garbage, after garbage, after garbage, until you arrive at Total War Pharaoh, shovelware of the most offensive sort. At which point, the company's then beginning to actually feel the burn, because they've lost so many of their old fans that they're no longer selling as quickly as they did. And when they're not selling as quickly, they're no longer a sales sensation. They're no longer a game that everybody talks about. And so the normies don't care either, because the only reason the normies were interested to begin with was because of the die-hard fans going, oh god, you gotta try this is amazing! And so the company begins seeking back to those old school fans, attempting to appease them as Creative Assembly has. Games Workshop is going to go along the exact same trajectory. They are going to have a period of massive growth. We're in that segment right now where the die-hard fans are going, 40k is amazing! And that's going to draw in everybody else. The current generation of, say, VTubers, for example, watching 40k lore content videos. That is that. That's the normie going, wow! Line go up. This will lead to 40k being picked up by the big corporations like we see with Amazon now. Line go up. But then, eventually, the old school fans will move on to something else, anything else, because the thing they originally loved is not there, and they are trying to purchase it from a company that actively hates you and who doesn't even bother about the setting itself. This is why I keep pointing out all the little mistakes, like calling the Ultramarines the 8th Legion, the Night Lords, for example, because it displays a lack of passion and interest. Then, as the old school fans stop talking about it, the normies, who are only chasing a trend to begin with anyways, will begin moving away, because they won't hear about it anymore. Those few of them who will have become fans will have become fans of an inferior product, as that is the mainstreamification and the normification of Warhammer 40k. Then they'll start drifting away again, because it's just not as good. There might be some nostalgia for when it was good, but that'll be about it. Then it'll start to plateau, as we see with Disney. Disney is in this stage and the early beginnings of the full-on decline, where they've realized that shit, we can't make anything new. Anything new we try to make doesn't sell because there's nobody who's actually into our stuff anymore. We don't have fans, we have customers, we have consumers, and they really only consume what others tell them to consume, and will then eventually begin to try and pivot back to what was once popular, as is Disney doing now with more investment in theme parks and cruise rides. However, this is a long process, and it isn't even guaranteed that the pivot will be successful. By the time this happens, which could be 10 to 20 years from now, there's no guarantee that anyone at Games Workshop will remember what a 40k is. They will have no idea what once made it popular. They will have no conceptualization of what grimdark is beyond everything sucks, which is already something we begin to see in settings like Trench Crusade, for example, whose entire lore is essentially based on terrible thing. Okay, but how does that work? Never mind, terrible thing. Now, the big deciding factor here is going to be the Amazon TV show, and I hate to want to bet against Henry Cavill, who's of course going to be heavily involved in that, because the man has done nothing wrong and has been actively punished for it every step of the way. Kind of reminds me a little bit of myself, as again, I was correct in all of this. I started speaking out about it a decade ago and was punished for it every step of the way, whilst the others who maintained the mainstream, who towed the party lines, shot ahead. But basically, if the Amazon TV show is a massive success, then the normies will flock, and all of the people who were once creating 40k content will be replaced with AI TikTok content as they get drowned out by the normies. Well, if that happens, we've got a 20-year growth period, 20 years of growth and stagnation, and GW will be overjoyed this entire time. They'll think to themselves, oh my god, thank god we got rid of that old shit audience that we didn't like anymore, as people meme on and latch on to the new thing. If it becomes a failure, we will see a 10-year period of growth and then leveling out and decline again. So at this point, 40k is already on the trajectory of being over. It is just a question of how long it takes until the last remnants of the passion, the burn and drive for 40k, wilters and dies out, as it did with DC, as it did with Marvel, as it did with Star Wars, as it did with Star Trek, as it did with Lord of the Rings. Although, granted, that had more to do with Amazon's Rings and Power rather than the popularity of the series, but you get my drift. This seems to be now the inevitable curve of all things going mainstream. Now, 20 years ago, we didn't know any of this because we hadn't seen this phenomenon with the internet. Now we have, and the data curve appears to be pretty fuck-on, dead-on consistent. Same thing again and again. You benefit of the initial passionate audience to drive yourself up to a plateau. Once you get there, you'll have gotten rid of most of the people who made your thing popular in the first place, and so the normies, who are only ever chasing the lasted trend anyway, will begin to drift away, and you will inevitably see the decline. At that point, the question that remains to be answered, as we haven't seen this yet with the Disneys and the Star Trek, Star Wars, etc. of the world, is if there is the potential for a recovery period. At the moment, it seems like there could be, with many of Disney's efforts to try to create old-school entertainment again, focusing in on their primary audience, kids, but at the same time, more often than not, the kids' favored movies now, well, they don't draw a young audience because it's aimed at kids, it's because it's aimed at the parents who once watched it and are now bringing their kids, with the only real exception probably being Minecraft, who is one of the few, like, counter-examples to this consistent trend of up, plateau, down. Although, one could easily argue that Minecraft is still on its up trajectory, at the very least until Notch makes his next game, which has already been hinted at being a spiritual successor of sorts. I mean, the man might be able to afford the legal fees to defend it, so hey, why not? But that is where we are with 40k right now, and I don't think we could ever have avoided coming to this point, as to avoid it, we would have had to talk the company out of what it thinks would have earned it money, of what would have earned it more money, of what would have made it the next Star Wars. And we would also have had to convince all of the content creators, the majority of which did it because of a trend, and were never interested in the long-term health of the property to begin with, that they too needed to form a unified front against the long-term degradation of the franchise. But again, if you're in it for the money and the fame of the trend, why would you ever do that? It's against your explicit interest, of course. And those who understood as well that it was in their explicit interest to instead simply just continue to make product, in the long term, well, they were the first to quit, as is the case of text-to-speech device. As has been talked about on several occasions, TTS was absolutely our best chance of delivering a legal defeat to Games Workshop, but TW would never have sued TTS first. They would have sued TTS last. However, TTS was intelligent enough to understand where this was going, and so instead of waiting until the inevitable, they jumped ship as quickly as humanly possible to move on to do other things, to grow their own brand and presence instead of somebody else's who hates you. Which, of course, is also what Yanovich is doing, but later on. I've had the same conversation with myself, God only knows how many dozens of times. Is it even worth making 40k content? Is it worth making lore? At this point, I do it as a hobby, in essence, which is why I've largely moved over to this channel, where I'm building far more of my own brand than anything else. It's why I'm making my own tabletop setting as well, because 40k is on its decline arc now. It's just a question of it'll be 1 decade or 2 decades until we see the proper fall-off begin. But that is all, of course, in the future. For now, is there anything that can be done? Well, if you still wish to try to enjoy 40k, enjoy the old school 40k. Seek alternatives, whatever there are, which aren't a whole lot, admittedly. And is there any effort to try and save 40k? Well, again, the only thing you can do there is try to lessen the size of the curve, to try and flatten the curve, as they used to like to say a few years ago. In which case, hope and pray that the Amazon show is an abject, absolute disaster, as that will severely damage Amazon's plans for 40k, and Games Workshop plans, of course, to use Amazon to further their own agendas. But I really hate betting against Henry Cavill, so what's an extra 10 years, huh? Anyways, I wanted to have this little rant on this topic, so until next time, I've been Arch. Thank you all very much for watching, and remember, again, Arch was right 10 years ago. He will be right in 10 years' time as well.